Okay, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar here at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's fantastic that we have a full room. Don't tell the fire marshal. I see we're at standing room only, and I don't know, you could look, there might be one more. No, there are no more seats. So thank you all for coming for this first meeting of the Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Alding. I serve as the faculty host of the seminar series. We're operating this semester as we have the last couple of years in a hybrid format. Thrilled to have several hundred of our friends and colleagues joining us on Zoom, in addition to everyone who's here in the room. Before we get started, I want to first offer a couple notes of thanks. First, thanks to the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and the Mostafa Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability for their support of this seminar series. More importantly, thanks to Paul Sherman and Liz Hanlon for everything they do to make everything go smoothly in our seminar series. And I'm thrilled and very grateful that we'll be able to kick off the seminar series this year with a talk by Sherri Goodman. Sherri will give us a talk about her new book, Threat Multiplier. She is a senior fellow at the Polar Institute in the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. She'll be speaking about the book Threat Multiplier, which was published by Island Press just about 3 weeks ago. And if you're a student, I hope you've had a chance to claim a raffle ticket. We have a couple copies of the book that we will raffle off at the end of the seminar. Sherri is also a senior strategist at the Center for Climate and Security and the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Previously, Sherri served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security over 1993 to 2001, or you can think of, at least as I do, colloquially as the Chief Environmental Officer of the Pentagon, and was the first one in that role. Also thrilled to have Sherri here because she's an alumna of Harvard University, having earned degrees from both the Kennedy School of Government and the law school. Sherri, welcome back to Harvard and welcome to the seminar series. Great to see you.
Okay, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Well, it's great to be here with you. This is really like a homecoming for me, as I was a student here many years ago. And first, thank you, Joe, very much for inviting me to kick off this seminar series, and to Paul and Liz for organizing it, and to some of my former faculty, Bill Hogan, Henry Lee, John Holdren, if you're on the line. He has a very nice quote on my book here. So thank you very much. And I've many more who aren't able to be here with us today. I'd like to say you're all here to hear my talk, but I know the free lunch helps too. So, but this really truly is for me a homecoming here, as I started here in the 1980s. And this story, which I'm going to tell you about my new book, Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security, is also my own personal journey that starts here. So for those of you who are students trying to figure out where you're going to go in your life, I'd say that that's part of this journey. And when I started here, I wasn't doing environment. I wasn't doing climate. I was doing, and this is what we're going to go through a little bit today, the birth of climate insecurity. We're going to look at climate risk through the eyes of generals and admirals, and how the military is leading by example, and then how we can climate proof our security. And I'm going to start here with this through line, this convergence as I've seen it throughout my career of national security and environment and climate security. When I started here in the 1980s, it was all about nuclear weapons. I was a teaching fellow for Graham Allison, for Ash Carter, for Joe Nye, for Al Cardasale, and it was all about how we could manage the atom. I know there's still a project on that even today. And during those days of the Cold War, we were not thinking as much about environmental issues. And then as we see the progression moving from the Cold War into the terrorism era, into 9/11 and the terrorism era, and then into the COVID era, we can see on the bottom sort of the rise of attention to environmental issues in our own country and internationally. Now, some smart people were already thinking about it. I know Henry Lee and Bill Hogan and a few others here were, but a lot of the security people were not thinking about the nexus between climate and security during those early days when the Environmental Protection Agency was created, the first international panel on climate change, the Montreal Protocol, and then into the Paris era. But let's go back a little bit, because I'm going to take you back to my beginning, which really launched here because of my focus on nuclear weapons and arms control in the Cold War. And my first book, which was on the neutron bomb controversy, a case study in alliance politics. When I left the Kennedy School, that's what I wanted to do. And I was fortunate enough through the people I had met here, including in the national security programs, to have an opportunity to work on the Senate Armed Services Committee for the chairman, Senator Sam Nunn. And that's where I met Kevin Knobloch, who's here in the audience, who worked for Senator Tim Wirth at the time, also on armed services, later served as chief of staff for Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz. Thank you, Kevin, for your service. And when I joined the Armed Services Committee, I had oversight for the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex. So think back, if any of you can remember, that we used to use nuclear reactors and processing facilities to make fissile materials that go into nuclear weapons and bombs, right? Plutonium, tritium, and uranium. And during that era of the late 1980s, all of these facilities shut down for environment, safety, and health lapses. In fact, I went to visit one of them in Colorado, in Senator Wirth's state, called Rocky Flats, where we processed plutonium to go into nuclear pits. And I was told, ma'am, are you of childbearing age, as I was about to walk into a building? And I said, well, yeah. And they said, well, don't go in there then. And that's where there were glove box operations to manipulate plutonium pits. And there were women working in there. And within a few months, the FBI had shut down that facility and a number of others. And that was emblematic of what happened as we became awash in plutonium, the Cold War ended, and environmental requirements became such that we stopped these facilities entirely. And that's when I say my career went from weapons to waste. And so I followed that thread into the Pentagon in the early 1990s. I came back, I practiced law in Boston for a few years at a law firm, and then became, as Joe said, the chief environmental officer at the Department of Defense. And there are kind of three parts to this journey that I had for 8 years there. That is the birth, really, of environmental security. First, it was a lot about cleaning up military bases at that time. And that's a picture of me running with President Clinton at Alameda in the summer of Alameda Naval Air Station in Oakland in summer of 1993, when we announced a major round of base closures, and he committed to fast-track cleanup at those bases. Now, any of you who study environment know there's nothing inherently fast about a government-run environmental anything. It's designed to be effective, but not necessarily efficient. So we decided that we had to meet the president's commitment. And in that era, we were even I was transferring funding to the Environmental Protection Agency and to state agencies to help them keep pace with our commitment to speed up those environmental reviews so that we could work with communities to turn property over to them. So that was, and so the military was making good on lapses of prior years. We were also working to conserve natural resources. Many people don't know that the military bases around the country have become islands of nature. And the military is the second largest landholder in the US, with 25 million acres of land with many endangered species. This is the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker, which makes its home in the longleaf pine tree, which which once covered most of southeastern U.S. and is now mostly vibrant on military bases from Florida to North Carolina. And so the Army had its training shut down for a time for failure to protect the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker, and then learned that, oh, by the way, well, we could redesign our training. So instead of cutting down the tree in the training areas, it made the tree become a realistic training obstacle. And then the Marine Corps, which also had the same ecosystem on its bases nearby, designed an environmental campaign, or we're saving a few good species. So that's emblematic of the era of attending to natural resource conservation. Another example of this early era of environmental security was sharing our knowledge with allies and partners. And at that time, we were working very closely with Russia to denuclearize the former Soviet Union. Some of you in this room may have even worked on that or are now working on the subsequent projects to that. There was a big effort here, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which Ash Carter, later who was Secretary of Defense, was very involved in, formerly with my former boss, Senator Nunn, Cooperative Threat Reduction. We were also working to remove liquid waste streams from decommissioned and sunken nuclear submarines that the Norwegians felt were a threat to their fishing grounds. And so this is Arctic military environmental cooperation with the Russian, U.S., and Norwegian defense ministers signed in 1996. And that's the cask in the far right that we built, the Norwegians and the U.S. built with the Russians to safely offload those liquid waste streams for safer inland storage. We were also speaking at military academies, and this is emblematic of work we were doing with militaries around the world in that era to share those experiences. A lot of that continues to this day, although not with Russia anymore, of course, but with militaries around the world now, there is a very vibrant set of environmental and climate security cooperation. Okay, let's move to the climate era. You know, in the 1990s, when I served in defense, climate only just came on the radar sort of at the end in the Kyoto, when we were negotiating the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And at that time, the military thought that it needed an exemption from greenhouse gas emissions limits because it didn't know how to manage those from emissions from military operations, although we did propose limits on installations and non-tactical vehicles. That got overtaken by events of later framing of how to manage greenhouse gas emissions. That is the currency today of net zero, and now military emissions are actually all addressed in the greenhouse gas emissions accounting. But at the time, we didn't, it took us until the 2000s when I convened the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change, when I was at a think tank called the Center for Naval Analysis, where we really looked at what does it mean for our security? Not just what does it mean for our tactical operations, but what does it mean for global security? What's going to happen as temperatures warm, sea levels rise, and we experience the other effects? And there was a lot of skepticism, you know, at the time about climate about climate in general and climate as a security issue. So I spent a year of study with others, analysts, with about a dozen senior retired military leaders, learning from the world's leading climate scientists like Jim Hansen and others. And then we produced this first report called National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, where we characterized climate change as a threat multiplier for instability that would affect us in fragile regions of the world, first and foremost. We understood that even back now 17 years ago. But we also thought that it would affect us even in stable regions and at home. And that has all come to be true, and probably much faster than we even predicted. And we also connected climate change, national security, and energy, which obviously seems obvious to all of you in the energy field here today or in economics. But that connection had really not yet been thought through. Okay, and we did then further reports, about a dozen of them, on the accelerating risks of climate change. We really looked at these climate threat multipliers. You know what they are: rising heat, drought, prolonged drought, fires. Now we have wildfires year round, sea level rise, flooding, storms. We also have permafrost thaw and collapse, ocean acidification, and other challenges. Now, it's not just the physical risks, as we see on the last slide. It's the connection to these compound and cascading risks. That's how the security implications unfold, because they lead to growing food and water insecurity and water scarcity and exposure to diseases and changing disease vectors. I spent last Friday at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where they're doing some deep dives into the health impacts of climate change and changing ecosystems. And that is all on top of instability and conflict that we already face around the world, from a combination of weak governance, inequality and poverty, demographics, and now leading to uncoordinated migration. So all of this is in the mix, and we are seeing this play out ever more so just in the last few days. The devastating floods in parts of Africa, on top of a drought-stricken region, now in Mali, Niger, parts of Nigeria. Tremendous loss of life. Many people have lost their homes. Many people are now without adequate food and water, all in areas that already have weak governance. Okay, so let's do a little tour around the world here, through the eyes of generals and admirals who've been on the front lines of climate risks. And I tell all these stories in my book. I know 2 of you will be fortunate enough to get it, but the rest of you, you can get a discount to buy. Okay, so this is Admiral James Fogo. When he was a young submariner, he went up to the Arctic, and this is this would have been in the mid 1980s. And they get up to the Arctic and they do a maneuver called ice pick, and they lift up out of the ice, and then the submariners get to pop out, and they get to maybe play a little baseball and put on a Santa suit and take some pictures. And this is sort of been a very classic Arctic activity for our submarine force. And when he went back about 20 years later, then in command of a different submarine, went back to approximately the same place, he couldn't find enough ice to do the same ice pick maneuver anymore. And when he actually surfaced his sub, he found blue water and plastic waste. So that's an example of what he experienced personally. But now, in a geopolitical sense, in a geostrategic sense, this is a map of the Arctic. And as you can see, Russia owns most of the Arctic coastline. And Russia under Putin has ambitions for a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. That ambition and goal slowed a little bit by the war in Ukraine, but nonetheless, Putin has still militarized and nuclearized large parts of the Arctic region now, with nuclear icebreakers, floating nuclear power plants, and also attacks on transportation. China, meanwhile, eyes the Arctic as declaring itself a near Arctic stakeholder, working with Russia to extract energy resources, learn how to operate in the Arctic, find minerals in the region, and in the future, potentially fish, especially when the Central Arctic, decades from hence, opens up. But even in the next 15 to 20 years, it's anticipated that there will be a ice-free Arctic route for at least several months of the year. And any day now, we will get the annual NOAA Arctic report card, which will show us how sea ice levels have declined, probably again from the previous years. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Arctic. In the Middle East, North Africa, a region long rich in oil, but poor in water, becoming even more so now, with climate stress. This is General Tom Mittendorf, who is my co-chair of the International Military Council on Climate and Security and the former Dutch Chief of Defense. He has his own book called The Climate General, which I also commend to you. It's now out in English and in paperback. And he had a lot of deployments in this region, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. And he was on the front lines of seeing how water stress and water insecurity combined with conflict and weak governance in each of those regions was leading to further instability. And even in certain cases, he was able to help negotiate, provide water in some of these communities, which led at least to a temporary cessation of hostilities. Can't say it solved all the problems, but he saw that there. Now, also, especially when we think about this region of Africa, and it's true in other regions, climate becomes ever more connected to how we think about building resilience and stability and our security. This is Swati Virvahali. She now serves on the National Security Council. She's an environmental engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers. And she coined this phrase, I quote in the book, concept of mutually assured resilience, something we will see likely I think we'll see this further develop in the future, which is just like in the Cold War, we had the concept of mutually assured destruction, that by the US and the Soviet Union holding each other hostage with its nuclear weapons, we would ensure stability because we could annihilate each other. In this era, in the climate era, without building resilience in communities around the world, we cannot guarantee our own security. Okay, moving to the Indo-Pacific region, this is Admiral Sam Locklear, who served as commander of Indo-PACOM. And in fact, at a talk here at Harvard, I think at the Kennedy School some years ago, he observed that in his view, climate is the greatest long-term threat to Indo-Pacific security. And at the time, Senator Jim Inhofe was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, somebody I work with long, and nice man, but not very supportive of climate. And he called Admiral Locklear in after he'd given some remarks here in Boston and in Cambridge, and had a hearing and challenged him on it. And I tell again this story in the book that Admiral Locklear stood his ground. He didn't get to be a 4-star by not standing his ground, and said, look, I've sent a lot of my forces now in this region to respond to typhoons, stronger storms, floods, and I've seen that this is undermining the stability of the region. Okay. And here is another example of how the region is being extensively affected by it, and our own security as well. There are certain small island Pacific nations, from Kiribati, pictured here, to Tuvalu, that will lose some of their atolls, their land, in coming years because of sea level rise and loss of fresh water. So for them, it's an existential risk. And many of these countries are strategically important to the US as we defend against growing Chinese influence and aggression in the region. There was just last night a very interesting, I recommended you, interesting segment on 60 Minutes about Chinese aggression against the Philippine Coast Guard and forces on the shoals within the Philippines EEZ. So this is an increasingly tense situation in this region, fundamental to our future security. And as we think about those small island nations and others around the world increasingly displaced by climate effects, and global migration increasingly being a component of migration as we see around the world, with children, of course, very deeply affected. And nowhere is that more true than in Latin America. This is General Laura Richardson. She is the commander now of our Southern Command, Southcom. She's one of the first female 4-stars we have. We also have the Chief of Naval Operations stays, General Lisa Franchetti, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard. Linda Fagan. So when I was a student like you guys here, we didn't think that was possible. Women couldn't even fly combat. And now it's all happening. So it's a great new era. She is dealing with these challenges in Latin America combined with weak governance, climate instability, drought, agricultural loss, growing Chinese influence on trade in the region. And so these are all part of the security mix in this region. Okay, let's come home now to the US and talk about military bases here at home a little bit. Many of them are significantly affected by climate risk from sea level rise. In particular, this is Norfolk Naval Base, the world's largest Navy base down in Norfolk, also has a NATO headquarters. All the services have this. Admiral Ann Phillips, who was in command of the Expeditionary Strike Group at Norfolk during Superstorm Sandy, actually sent her forces there from Norfolk up to New York to replace the Coast Guard, which got knocked out in that storm, and they actually operated the port for several days. And so Secretary of Defense at the time, Leon Panetta, observed that we're using our military in a war against nature herself, as we deploy forces ever more frequently for natural disasters and humanitarian relief. This here is Tyndall Air Force Base, whose hangars got destroyed in Hurricane Michael in 2017, where the F-35 is stored, and now it's becoming a climate-resilient base of the future, being built back better to withstand higher winds and with improved energy. So as we talk a little bit about energy, and because this is an energy policy seminar, I'm going to spend a few minutes here on how the Department of Defense uses energy. So Department of Defense is the nation's single largest energy user. It's about 1% of total US energy. Most of it, as you can see here, is in what we call operational energy. In other words, for ships, tanks, and aircraft, mostly for fuel for aircraft. The rest, the other third, is for bases, in what we call installation energy. Okay, so the focus today is on moving to net zero. So the Department of Defense now has ambitious goals to move to net zero by 2050 and net zero in electricity by 2035. Those are the administration's goals. And doing so in a way that involves what we call sort of less fuel and more fight. So for many years, when I started out in this field, it was axiomatic that if you were going to have a more powerful weapon system, you needed more fossil fuel. So think of the Abrams battle tank, which takes 2 gallons per mile, right? So, tanks have been gas guzzlers, right? Same with fighter aircraft and bombers. But that connection, that Gordian knot between fuel and military effectiveness was finally broken about 10 years ago. And now there is a major push on to improve effectiveness while lowering energy use. Everything from better efficiency in weapon systems design to renewables for deployable forces to changing out how we use fossil fuels. We learned the hard way in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that we were putting our forces at risk because 8 out of 10 of the military convoys in those 2 wars were for fuel and water and ammunition, for military logistics. Okay, and those soldiers and Marines driving those trucks were subject to attack by improvised explosive devices. And so that in itself was a motivator in sort of what I call kind of the first era of energy innovation in the military. Now, here I'm going to show you a couple of different examples here of how today the military is looking at different types of energy innovation for our ground forces. This is something called GREENS. The Marines are developing ground renewable expeditionary energy network system that has solar, battery, and is man portable, so you can deploy all in one system and power your operation. This is going to be a very big deal for the Air Force. This is called the Blended Body Wing aircraft, and it's a new design for a future for a future fighter that is 30% more efficient, has 30% less drag. So even on existing fuels, and by the time we finally develop it, hopefully there'll be some better fuels available, but even on existing fuels, it's 30% more efficient. That alone will reduce substantially fuel use. Then there are some developments in nuclear power for military bases. Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska is working to deploy a small micro nuclear reactor, next generation of clean, reliable energy. I think we will see more of this many places around the world, but particularly for remote military bases and remote operations. Here at Fort Liberty, the former Fort Bragg in North Carolina, this is a very large floating solar array that powers a significant portion of the base and also shares energy with the base. And the other benefit of this, having deployed it on the Big Muddy Lake, is it doesn't take up the natural resource area, and it saves water, and it has on-site battery storage. And here is the military's first net zero base in Albany, Georgia. It's got microgrid, it's got waste to energy plant, and it provides energy resilience because most military bases now are under a requirement to operate for 2 weeks if the grid goes down. So microgrids, renewables, better batteries, small modular reactors in the future, all of this is necessary in order to be able to move to a new generation of distributed energy resources. And then just to close out a little bit here, I want to share with you some thinking from the Defense Science Board, which is the Department of Defense's sort of Secretary of Defense study group that kind of looks at where we need to innovate in the future. And last year we did a study on climate change and global security. And one of the areas we looked at is this overdependence on minerals and fossil fuel processing in other countries, many of which obviously are China. So the need to diversify that mix. And also as we move to advanced energy sources, as you can see, we significantly need to diversify our onshoring and or friendshoring of these resources needed to power our energy future. Okay, let me close out with sharing with you my thoughts here on how we need to move to how do we move to the future. And there's really 4 parts of this. And each of them merit their own talk in themselves, but I'm going to go through it short and sweet. We can pick it up further in the discussion if you would like. And the first is what I call climate intelligence. It's really improving our climate prediction. Today, we have reliable weather. We know that today's a beautiful day, beautiful summer day here in Boston, right? And if you look at your weather app, you can see reliable weather forecast out for about a week, right? But you don't know what it's going to be like 2 months from now reliably, or 6 months from now. We have global climate models, and they tell us that this is how the climate is going to change out 50 to 100 years. And they're good for setting our targets for greenhouse gas emissions, but they're not necessarily good for planning purposes. So we need to both, so think of it, we've got time scales and we've got geographic scales. We have to shorten our time scales. We have to extend our time scales, on climate, and then narrow our geographic scales to make these reliable climate intelligence predictions. That's what's happening today in the world of climate prediction. It's happening in the private sector. It's happening in every sector of society: transportation, finance, banking, insurance. Your insurance companies now are getting more real-time data for near-in observations. That's why many of them are not providing insurance in high-risk regions of the country anymore, like Florida or parts of California. So the military needs this type of climate intelligence too, scoped to meet its missions, whether it's a war game or a deployment or planning the next round of infrastructure. Second, we have to adapt and become resilient to manage the climate risks that have already baked in. Unfortunately, we are going to exceed that 1.5 target in the Paris Agreement. Even if we stay on track, or even if we keep close to that or don't get above 2 degrees, we still, as we know today, are experiencing significant climate risks. Every summer is hotter, every wildfire season is longer, storms are more intense, more precipitation, more drought in other areas. So we need to become resilient as a society. And for our security, what that means is we have to become resilient at our bases. For our troops, there's a whole health component of that, and with our communities overall. Third, we do have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The military is trying to do its part, not only because, as we say, it's as much about missions as it is emissions. Today, it is clear that military effectiveness will be improved by advanced forms of energy. But think of hybrid vehicles. They provide, as our Deputy Secretary of Defense has said, they are quieter and they have better torque. So there are advantages over existing vehicles as we move into this age of electrification. And finally, our alliances. We can't do this alone. We're very fortunate that we have 2 NATO members, new NATO members today, and that's partly because of Putin's war in Ukraine. But we need to continue to nurture not only our NATO allies, but our allies around the world, because climate and resilience know no boundaries. And that's how we're going to be able to improve our security and leave a better world for our children and hopefully my future grandchildren. So that's the book. I look forward to our discussion today, and I thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Sherri. We will take questions from the audience. As a reminder, questions typically are the form of a sentence that ends in a question mark. I'm going to use the host or chair's prerogative in asking the first question. So this was fantastic, Sherri, and it was great hearing about the sort of, if you will, sort of data-driven experiences of these generals and admirals and how they started to think more about the risk of climate and how it affects their missions and their objectives. I would say right now we look at sort of politics in the United States. There tends to generally be bipartisan support for having a strong military, and yet when it comes to climate change, there's quite a significant partisan divide. So how do you see where some of the lessons that we've learned from our military leaders, as they see how climate change is affecting the job they're tasked to do, how might that help us better understand the risk of climate and our opportunities for addressing climate that might potentially bridge some of these divides in the US?
Right. Joe, yes, very important. And in fact, in legislative terms, and one of the things I really have always loved about the Kennedy School is that you've got theory and practice mixed together. And virtually all of your professors here have also been practitioners. And I think of myself as really a policy practitioner. And so since my very first early experiences were in working in the legislative branch, drafting legislation on the annual must-pass defense authorization bill, and then being a decade or so and beyond in think tanks in the receiving end of that legislation in the Defense Department, I realize how important that is. And in defense policy and defense legislation, we have some of the most bipartisan approaches to climate, because just there's some very practical politics that I think can be extracted to other areas. The first is that if you have a military base in your district, you don't want to lose it. It doesn't matter how high the sea is rising or how much wildfire you have. Those are jobs, and that's investment. So when Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida was heavily damaged in 2018, the Republican congressional delegation was the first to say that we're going to rebuild Tyndall Air Force Base and put the investment in the defense budget to do that. So that's one very practical point. I'd say, with the demand signal growing for the likes of FEMA and Coast Guard and other sort of the federal government first responders, plus state first responders, we're already paying. We're paying for it in the consequence of it, because we're not paying enough in prevention right now. Neither of those two agencies and many others have enough resources in their preventive capacities. They have it in the response. And then, as we say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So we should be using the climate crisis to get ahead of this. And I think, as I say, I think of myself like Madeleine Albright as optimist who worries a lot. So on my optimistic side, I'm modestly hopeful that efforts like the Conservative Climate Caucus, led by a moderate Republican from Utah, John Curtis, and others like him, they really understand. And I traveled with him to Iceland and a number of Republican others with Aspen Congressional Institute a few years ago about energy. And I think they really get it, so I'm modestly hopeful that on the energy side and sort of community resilience side, we can come together. On global approaches, I'm less optimistic, although I do think fundamentally that climate reforming our global financial institutions is increasingly a security concern.
Great. Let me open it up for questions.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sherri. Very insightful. I have a question on the evolving climate and national security overlap and the role of the US in global governance, especially in light of the recent presidential debate and how the presidential race will play out.
Do you want me to cast my crystal ball here? I mean, so I think one candidate is going to accelerate us into the future along the path that we've been on. I think the other will likely not. I mean, there are a few areas of bipartisan agreement, which I would say are probably nuclear power is one of those. And perhaps how we deal with our shortfalls and overdependency on minerals. But I think we will be, they have widely different views on energy, climate, and particularly climate. When Trump was president and climate was a four-letter word around most of the U.S. government, I ran what I call a series of keeping hope alive projects, because it wasn't that people in government weren't working on this. They were. In fact, the Army and later the whole Department of Defense developed during that era something called the Defense Climate Assessment Tool to assess climate risk at military bases. And now that tool is widely used to assess risk, and we're even sharing that tool with a number of our foreign allies and partners. But people used other terms to talk about it. I ran a series of projects during that era. We called it Improving Predictive Capability for Disruptive Water and Weather Events.
Thank you, Sherri. Fascinating talk and excited to read the book. Wondering to what extent, if any, a China or a Russia is playing ball on some of these kind of climate cooperation ideas, or interested in the concept of kind of mutually assured resilience. Wondering what the kind of low-hanging fruit on that might be in the Arctic or in the Pacific, and where you see the kind of, I guess, whether there are any fruits that are just too high to consider anytime soon.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a good question. Let me separate that out. So, China, while we are, heavily competing with China and there's contested areas in the South China Sea, there still is a fair amount of cooperation among environmental experts and organizations with China, both on everything from emissions to improve water security or water sharing or water management and energy practices, even though they're competitively they're far ahead in some areas of renewables. But there still is educational and scientific and other exchange, which I think it's always important to keep those channels open. We don't have that with Russia now since they invaded Ukraine. And in the Arctic in particular, with Russia having most of the Arctic, we no longer have those sort of scientific exchanges. So there's an absence of sort of scientific diplomacy with Russia. Now, the other Arctic nations continue the work of the Arctic Council, and that's important because understanding the changing Arctic has long been sort of a scientific endeavor. Even during the Cold War, there was very robust kind of scientific exchange with the Russians. So that is, that's a problem. It's a problem not only for Russia, but it's a problem because we don't understand fully how permafrost thaw and collapse is both affecting and making more dangerous their infrastructure, the risks they're taking. We know they're more prone to take risks just because of inattention to safety. Think of the Chernobyl or the cursed submarine accident where all the sailors died on board. And also methane releases from permafrost. I know there's a very active Arctic initiative here at Harvard. I do a lot of Arctic work myself, and one of the projects that we've had is trying to better document methane release from permafrost thaw and collapse, because most of the methane release in global climate models today and the pledge to reduce methane by 30% by 2030 is mostly based on modeling methane release from oil and gas production, not from the methane that comes out of thawing permafrost. And most of the permafrost, there's a lot in Russia, in Canada, obviously, and the US Arctic as well.
Hi, Sherri. Name's Navi.
Hi.
Thank you. It was a wonderful talk. I guess, especially drawing on your experience during kind of the nuclear era and thinking about scientific innovation, the military's role in that, I think in the nuclear era, the military was driving a lot of that innovation of the technology. Do you see that dynamic changing, I guess, in between whether military or civil society is driving emerging technologies for like net zero or kind of like climate friendly tech?
That is a really great question because who innovates where has really changed in the last few decades. We think back in the Cold War and from the 50s, at least through the 70s, if not into the 80s, government R&D investment, particularly in defense, drove the development of a lot of innovative technologies, from everything from GPS to the internet. And we talked about spinning out technologies from the defense sector into the commercial sector. Now it's the other way around. Now defense R&D is a very modest part of overall R&D spending, and government R&D spending in general, particularly in the U.S., is an increasingly smaller share of total R&D spending, which means that technologies are spinning into defense. So there's long been an effort to do COTS, commercial off-the-shelf technology, but now also to just bring in commercial technology, particularly in the energy sector. It's being adapted for military uses, but a lot of the innovation itself is occurring here, and MIT and Silicon Valley and other places around the country, or with Bill Gates' funded efforts and philanthropy. So it's really shifted. The role that I think the Defense Department can play constructively in this era is going to be less in, and we did a report for the International Military Council on Climate and Security. If you're really interested in this, look up International Military Council on Climate Security, our most recent report, which we released at the NATO summit this summer on defense innovation and military energy. And in addition to that finding, the other one is that the real role of the militaries now is going to be in its procurement processes, and it's in contracting, because if it can be an off-taker for new energy, or it can be an early buyer. Let's say if it can help establish new markets for small modular reactors, or expand the charging, or better batteries, for example, long-term storage. It can help. It can help pave the way for more widespread adoption, but it won't necessarily be doing all that innovative R&D itself, as we used to think. Yeah.
Is it just on? Okay, cool. Hi, thank you, Sherri. To what extent do you think US trade policy can be integrated to support energy security goals? And do you think current stance, particularly regarding China, is supportive or detrimental to energy security?
To what extent do I think trade policy can be integrated? And what was the second half?
And to what extent do you think it's currently supportive or detrimental to?
Support. Well, it certainly can be integrated. The rub always tends to be, to the extent you want to use trade policy to do Buy American or not. Do you want to be protectionist or not? So if you were not thinking about that dimension of trade policy, you could do more to more seamlessly establish the markets in advanced energy. But if you're more worried about either not letting China have battery plants in Michigan, or it all has to be about jobs here, then it's just a complicated mix, and any one decision can have particular ramifications. So I think they should be, and I'm sure in this administration they've tried to integrate them, but there's also a lot of these individual eaches that sometimes have to do with particular politics in locations.
I saw some hands in the back of the room.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. On the previous point, I think the US is still doing quite a bit through the DOE, the national laboratories. These guys do incredible work.
Yeah.
But to my actual question, it was great to see these initiatives to decarbonize military operations. However, I wonder what share of operational emissions do they actually capture if they were implemented to a full degree? Because I personally, for example, struggle to see carbon-free F-35 operations or aircraft carriers that don't rely on heavy emissions. Is that being strategized for the long run somewhere in the DoD, or is it more of a blind spot?
No, I mean that's the goal. Those are the climate plans of all the services, to be net zero. And it's easier, of course, to start at military bases because you can put on microgrids and you can change out your stationary power, to be more reliant on fossils, on renewables, better batteries, in the future nuclear. Some places even have geothermal. It's going to be harder, of course, with weapon systems, but that is the goal, and there are plans. But those 2050 is still a few decades away. So that's why innovations like the blend, more efficient design. It doesn't mean there won't be any fossil fuels. There will always be fossil fuels, but can they be decarbonized? And can you move to net zero?
Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Daniela, and I wanted to ask about purchased electricity. So from my understanding, the military relies on the same power grid that civilians do, and to meet rising electricity demand and make that 100% carbon-free, as well as secure, reliable, resilient, etc., I'm wondering what actions can and should DoD take to upgrade and expand the U.S. power grid?
Well, the whole initiative to have microgrids is an effort to diversify away from being reliable on the national electric grid, because the military can't control what utilities and local system operators do in both the Western grid, the Eastern grid, and then the Texas is its own grid. Those determinations are not going to be made based on the Department of Defense. So in the first instance, the military has to think about how does it secure power so they can operate 24/7, particularly for critical mission infrastructure. That's why there are these goals to island base and from energy. Now, at the same time, I would say that in states where you have very strong mandates, let's say in California or other places, the military has to operate and meet those mandates. So those state mandates can go a long way to directing the military because they direct investment. In other words, if California says you got to have zero emission power by X date or whatever, then all those bases in California, they get to set their requirements to meet that earlier than, let's say, another state that doesn't have that requirement. So it's going to drive investment. States will drive investment in what happens at any particular military base.
Hi, my name is Emil. Thanks for a great talk. Can't wait to read the book. I have a question about the UN. You generally see increasing attention on climate security, both at the council level, we've seen resolutions, but increasingly also at the agencies adopting this climate lens to look at the root causes of conflict.
Yeah.
So my question is, what role do you see for the UN in bridging some of these challenges in alliance building that you'd previously discussed?
Okay, good question. I mean, the UN does have, an important role, and there has been increasing attention to climate as a security issue. In fact, 2007, when we released the first CNA Military Advisory Board report, was timed in part we released it in April of 2007, and the timing was set for two factors. One, the next week, the UN held its first Security Council debate on climate and security, and the UK foreign minister used the phrase threat multiplier in her remarks, and she took it right from our report. And then also we had the defense authorization bill was coming up for markup, and we wanted them to include our recommendations. So yes, the UN has a role. It's complex. There are a lot of complex actors in it. The role of the military in this debate is less than, I would say, development and diplomatic agencies, as it should be. The UN has its own peacekeeping forces. The role of this kind of a climate lens there, the beneficial role, I think, will be more in what I call environmental peace building. In fact, I received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Environmental Peace Building Association this summer in The Hague, and that's connected to the piece of the story I told you about how a lot of this about environmental practices in the military, environmental security being a form of peace building, whether it's water sharing, water security cooperation among Israeli, Jordan, and until October 7th, Palestinians to improve conditions in the Middle East or within parts of conflict-ridden Africa. There are a lot of environmental peace-building efforts at the local level that can't necessarily give you a better head of state, but they can reduce poverty and alleviate some water insecurity at the local level. And I think that's part of the UN's role, to bring it down to that practical level, and then to try to get more global consensus. But that's hard because the IPCC itself there's a lot of challenges, and that's a whole another topic.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I really like the book title, and I'm curious about sort of what you think about the other side of the effect. So you characterize climate as a threat multiplier to security. So what do you think is the effect of security on climate change itself? In terms of, like, does it make this issue more salient? Like, does it fundamentally change the issue in any way? And do you see specific climate issues as more amenable to securitization or less amenable to securitizations? For example, like mitigation versus adaptation, different types of issues.
Yeah, well, this whole field of securitization of X, it's an interesting concept. It's sort of an academic theory. I've explored its roots. I think as a practical policymaker, it doesn't really tell you that much. It's used more as a critique than as to what you can do. Okay, so I talk about from threat multiplier to opportunity multiplier. That's where we need to go. I talk about climatization of security rather than securitization of climate. So and I think if you want to really solve problems, you got to get down to how you fix them. And that's by sort of putting the climate lens, climate literacy into all of the right places in the security community, whether it's in, today I serve as the vice chair of the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board, and we did a study earlier this year, new security challenges in foreign policy, which had to do with how do you put climate and energy resource scarcity, as well as water, infectious disease, and gender and identity, all of that into our foreign policy planning process. Now, there's a lot of particular things when you get into how we develop our diplomatic strategies and the practical politics of the State Department. But you have to get down into those eaches to sort of make it real and sort of turn the system of government. And then again, in defense and intelligence, each of those has its own, has its own ways of institutionalizing change. And you have, so, as I say, I'm a person who's worked by being a change maker from within. There are good ways to be change maker from without, and those are very important too. But there are also, and if you're here, it used to be called Harvard Kennedy School of Government, right? Because we extol, and I still am a big believer in public service. And if you want to be a public servant at any level, state, federal, international, in or just outside of government, and I've served kind of just outside of government for a long time now, you have to figure out how do you move those levers. There's a lot of different levers to move. Sometimes, a good report with important people on it who can really get access to decision makers can help move some wheels of change. But that alone is never enough. You have to figure out how do you actually change the directives and the institutions and the legislation and then stay on it, and it's, and that's kind of the story of my career. I've kind of been in it the whole, for over 30 years, 40 years now. And I've seen that evolution, but it doesn't stop. And there's many more now, next generation coming along who are at the forefront, people like Swati Virabhali and others who are going to lead this next generation of climate and environmental change.
Hi, thank you. My question is about the projected increase in human migration we're likely to see through 2050. I'm wondering how DoD thinks about that, and whether there's efforts to how the adaptation piece fits into that complicated issue.
Right. So, the military is usually the 911 response force when there's a problem. It's not the solution driver for that, but it's very much in those discussions and deliberations in the government today, thinking about how to deal with more migration and how to, the solution set really is in development and diplomacy, or better disaster risk reduction strategies, and in local solutions that allow for resilience in the community so that people don't have to leave. Most migration still globally is internal displaced migration within countries or within regions, but increasingly with climate, it is becoming more global. I think we've an understanding of how in the security sector of how migration can be destabilizing is important to motivate developing the solutions, most of which are not military, to improving the lives and livelihoods of people where they are. That's the sort of in the environmental peace building, better development strategies, and particularly improve financial assistance and reform of global financial institutions. That's why there's a growing body of scholarship on reforming climate, global multilateral development banks and other financial institutions as important from a security standpoint.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I wanted to ask a little bit about resource constraints of climatization of security. It seems likely that the wealthier countries that are available and those who have first mover advantage will be okay. But do you see this kind of process of climate strain on the international environment like intensifying interstate competition with a military angle to it?
Well, I think that's generally the case even without thinking about the military or the defense sector. I think that climate stress generally is aggravating the have-not divides between developed and developing countries, and it's only going to increasingly do so. The bright spots would be that, let's say some of the some of the growing wealthier countries and some, even the fossil energy countries in the Middle East now see it in their own interest to not only to change their own energy diversification, but to build resilience in more globally, because they see it as being in their security interest. And that was very evident at the last COP in Dubai. There was a whole focus on resilience, peace, and recovery. So I think that trends are there, but I don't think that overall global institutions really are up, have really risen to the occasion, which, I think militaries, I mean, you just had to look at this picture. It was just in the New York Times today about the response to the floods, the devastating floods in Africa, in Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. And there's a picture in one of this of maybe 50 people in a boat that looks like a little skiff to me, like a elongated skiff about to tip over in some flooded area, and the caption says military rescue boat, and you're thinking that's a military rescue, like, in other words, they're under equipped, and that's increasingly unfortunately the case. And can we do more? Should the U.S. be doing more? Yes. We should be doing more. Should we have a different balance between our development of funding and foreign policy funding and security, or defense funding? That's long been a challenge in the U.S. I mean, there was time even back about 10 years ago when Bob Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, said, I think we need to think about defense, and diplomacy together. We should have more robust, and he was arguing as Defense Secretary for more robust funding for the State Department. That was during the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, because he was seeing that it was hard to stabilize in those regions if our diplomats and development professionals are underfunded. Unfortunately, that's just continued to be the case. Back to Joe's first question about, politics extends not only to sort of climate, but extends to sort of this area of foreign engagement. And unfortunately, we have to do more to sort of educate people about why it's in America's interest to continue to be part of the world, that it is in our broader security interest.
Okay, great. So 3 quick items before we wrap up. First, we will meet again at noon a week from today. Monday, the 23rd, we'll be in Bell Hall on the 5th floor of the Belfer building for a talk by Robert Bonney, the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Robert will speak on agriculture's role in a clean energy future. Second, please join me in thanking Sherri Goodman for a fantastic talk here today. Thank you, Sherri.